Well, Oppenheimer, as I say, as a theoretical physicist, was more of a mathematician than anything else. In fact, I don't think he knew one end of a screwdriver from the other.
We did a lot of the I call it dog work. And it was work that had to be done, and it was work that we thought was important. So we hung in there till the job was done.
So Oppenheimer and the physicists were the ones who could dream up and design a weapon, but we were the ones that could make it work.
Die Bewegung, sie lebt und sie steht felsenfest begründet. Und solange auch nur einer von uns atmen kann, wird diese Bewegung seine Kräfte leihen und für sie eintreten. Und den Befehl gab uns kein irdischer Vorgesetzter, den gab uns der Gott, der unser Volk geschaffen hat. Unser deutsches Volk siegt ein! Siegt ein! Siegt ein! Siegt ein! Siegt ein! Siegt ein! Siegt ein!
He thought he was a madman. And he was a madman. You say to yourself, well, how did he have the right to do those kinds of things? And nobody was able to stop him.
We were racing against time. We thought we knew what the Germans were doing, and it turned out later we didn't, that they were way behind where we thought they were, but we didn't know that. And we were scared to death that they would get the answer before we did.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Absolutely disgusting. I could not believe that our military could be so dead on its feet. And Pearl Harbor never should have happened.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
When I got to Berkeley, right off the bat, Ernest Lawrence put me in charge of the design of the electromagnets for the pilot plant, for the big production plant that was going to be built at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Okay, I was doing that when Lawrence came in one day, and he said, Bob, he said, I want to warn you that this is Monday, that on Wednesday there's a couple of high-pressure artists that want to talk to you about doing something else. Well, he called me up Wednesday morning, and I got down to his office about 10 o'clock and walked in, and there sitting were Robert Oppenheimer and George Kistiakowsky. And about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Oppenheimer said, Bob, he says, do you subscribe to the National Geographic magazine? And I said, yeah, I do. And he says, well, do you read those ads in the back of the magazine that have to do with boarding schools? And he said, well, he says, there's one of them back there called the Los Alamos Ranch School for Boys, which is located in the mountains up back of Santa Fe, New Mexico. I've got something down there I'd like to show you. So I said, well, I'm right up to my ears now in a job for Oak Ridge that I'll be through within about a week. And I'd be very happy to come down and see you at that time. And with that, he reached in his coat pocket and he said, Bob, I have here a TWA ticket in your name on an airplane leaving San Francisco in 3 hours. Can you get ready? So I guess I got the message that I'd been shanghaied.
I think I was the only person to get off the train, as I recall. And I did telephone the telephone number that was given to me. And so I was sitting on the steps of the general store there in Lamy and been there for quite a while waiting for these guys, or waiting for some transportation. And this black Buick showed up with 2 civilians in it, which I knew couldn't be for me. I didn't deal with civilians. I dealt with military people. These guys pulled up right beside me and rolled down the window, and the guy said, "Are you Benjamin?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Okay, get in, we'll take you." And I, of course, tried to get information from them on what goes on, and they started giving me a hard time. I'm going up there and I'll never be seen or heard from again because the place is so classified, and once you get inside the 3rd fence, that's where I was going, that there would, I'd never be seen again.
Los Alamos itself was a typical Army camp, 2-story, 4-unit apartment buildings built out of green plasterboard. It was a military installation, and a lot of people don't realize that. It was strictly military. Everybody was in uniform except this cadre of civilians who were running the laboratory under Oppenheimer.
I knew absolutely nothing when I arrived there. I mean, I had a hard time understanding the fact that I was in the Manhattan District Engineers.
The SED acronym was Special Engineer Detachment, which was a part of the Manhattan District. This was an interesting arrangement. These were very bright young lads. They were all engineering graduates. Strange thing about them, some of them had doctor's degrees, and they might be working for a buck private. But nobody worried about these things. Totally, nobody paid any attention to rank.
I was taken aside by my boss, right, I think it was the same day I met him. And he was very frank with me and told me what was going on up there. They were going to build a weapon that could end the war. And we had the technophotographic group, and were involved in many aspects of the fabrication or the design of the weapon.
Kostiakowski was the head man in the area that I was working in. Kostiakowski was responsible for the implosion weapon, the high explosive system of the weapon we dropped on Nagasaki, as contrasted to the bomb that we dropped on Hiroshima, the gun-type gadget, which was nothing more than a gun. A projectile and a target, and the two of them became supercritical and made an explosion, but very, very inefficient. The little boy, the gun gadget, was being handled strictly by Captain Parsons. Kisty's was much more sophisticated, and nobody knew that it would even work, and that was the big question mark. We had to test it. We knew we had to test it. We did not have to test the one that we were going to drop on Hiroshima.
I worked on what we call the racetrack, and that was where we had the big tanks that separated the U-235 from the U-238. We had lots of problems. There was a continual change in design, and we had to incorporate all of these designs into the production of the U-235. And we were accumulating it one atom at a time. So we had these huge tracks. Some of them were 250 feet in diameter, and with a magnetic field that was 100 times stronger than any other magnetic field that had been generated at that time. In fact, we used 14,000 tons of silver in the bus bar that created the magnetic field.
Kostiakowski could not live with Parsons, Captain Parsons. They came from different worlds. Parsons was Navy from way back, and to him, a weapon was a gun. Anything else was not a weapon. And it drove Kisty absolutely insane because he was a physical chemist and highly scientific. And he was attempting to do something that Parsons way beyond him.
It takes a lot of U-235 to make a gun-type weapon. Gun-type weapons, you know, from past experiences, are very inefficient. When we came up with the implosion weapons, they were about 16 times as efficient as a gun-type weapon.
The showdown on this implosion weapon came in Oppenheimer's office.
I don't think there was any doubt in anyone's mind among the engineers and physicists that if we got enough U-235, we could make a bomb. But could we make a second one? The problem was that it took so long to accumulate the material for the first bomb that it was practically impossible to come up with a second bomb. That's why the emphasis went on to plutonium. And plutonium could be generated at Hanford, and if the implosion weapon worked, as it was demonstrated at Trinity, then we had a possibility of producing bombs very rapidly. Actually, we didn't have that capability. We only had one other bomb ready to go at the end of the war. And when Truman said, we're going to blast Japan from one end to the other, it was a big bluff.
Parsons sort of took over, and he says, Oppie, he says, I want you to put an end to the implosion weapon project. The thing that Kostiakowski's working on. It's a total waste of time and money. There's no way on God's green earth that Kisty can ever get the molds necessary to produce those HE castings to the quality that are required in the time that's available. It can't be done. It's a total waste of effort. I want you to assign all of his technical staff to me to work on the gun project. Well, of course, Kissy got very furious about that, and I couldn't take it, so I spoke up, and I said, Oppie, that's not true. I know how to build those molds, and I know where to get the help to do it. And, of course, General Groves was sitting against the wall, which is what he always did. He'd tilt a chair up against the wall and just listen to the fight. And so Oppie looked at me, he said, do you know what you're talking about? And I says, I sure do. So there's only one place in the United States where I can get the help that I need to build those molds in the quantities that are required, and that's the Chrysler Corporation in Detroit.
It was a very intense period of time. Los Alamos kept setting deadlines. We couldn't meet the deadlines. We had Secretary of War Stimson come by and go through our plant and tell us how important it was to get the production up. We had 75,000 people working on this project, and nothing was being turned out in terms of visible results. In fact, they used to say we bring in train loads of equipment to Oak Ridge, and nothing went out. Truly, it went out, but it went out in micrograms, milligrams, gram quantities, and eventually kilograms of U-235.
Got into Detroit, didn't even stop for breakfast. Went right into Chrysler and got up in Keller's office, and his production people said, yeah, we can do this. But Keller says, Leslie, he says, I'll tell you, you're going to close down the entire Chrysler Corporation. And he says, we are now the only producers of the Pratt & Whitney 4360 engine for the B-29 production line. So you're going to close down the B-29 production line for 2 days while we convert over to do this job. That's asking an awful lot, and is it worth it? And Groves turned to me, and I said, yes. So
we consequently drove ourselves. I mean, really, essentially drove ourselves. We worked 24 hours a day, had to keep the process going, and many times we worked double shifts in order to make up for an experiment that we were running or a design change we were trying to incorporate. We did everything we could to increase the production, and it wasn't until about 3 months before the end of the war that our production lines were really running.
On the airplane, as we were riding to Detroit, I said, General, I don't understand you. You're a civil engineer, and here you are working with all these world-famous physicists and chemists, metallurgists. I don't know how you do it. And he said, Bob, you don't watch carefully. He said, don't you watch how I start fights all the time? And he said, everybody hates my guts. He says, I'm probably the most hated guy in the whole U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He says, all I do is when we're at a stumbling block in an argument, he says, I start a fight between guys that I know collectively what the answer ought to be, or at least the best bet. I let these guys solve their own problems. He says, hell, I don't know a damn thing about what they're talking about. But I listen to them, and out of what they're saying, I can get a feeling for where the strength of the argument may lie. And then I make up my mind as to which horse I'm going to ride for the next week. And then we'll go through the whole process again. He says, I get so I hate myself. But he says, it is effective. It's a hell of a way to run a railroad, but it does work.
We're pushed not only by supervision, by military commanders, but also for personal reasons. Nearly all of us had somebody in the family overseas, and we knew how the Japanese were fighting.
One by one, the Japs were losing the islands they had grabbed. This was the island of Tarawa on November 20th, 1943. It was a hot fight, bitter and deadly.
I had personal concerns in that I had a brother fighting in the Fifth Army in Italy and a younger brother in the Pacific, in the Navy. My girlfriend at that time, and later became my wife, had two brothers killed in the invasion at D-Day. And they were the only two brothers she had.
If you try to detonate a ball of explosive or any surface of explosive, the detonation wave rushes out in all directions, just like throwing a pebble into a pond of water. And that's the last thing we wanted. We wanted the opposite. We wanted the waves to come in. And you can design a geometry then that turns that expanding spherical wave into a converging spherical wave, block by block. Underneath each detonator, that wave will get turned around from a diverging wave to a converging wave. If you get the detonators to all go at the same time, the waves all get at the same place at the same time. They were meant to squeeze the ball of plutonium in the center of the weapon to create the fission reaction. Now, that ball had to be almost a critical mass. And then the explosive was what pushed it over the edge. It simply compressed it, that small additional amount necessary to make it become supercritical.
With the implosion weapon, one had to have all the detonators go simultaneously. Yeah, it's a little difficult thing to do. In fact, a lot of people worked for long periods on that. But we had the camera that could resolve a microsecond.
Early on, they had a problem here of recording the information on oscilloscope screens. So pretty soon we built a special camera that just to photograph those screens. And they had to get resolving power like 10 to the minus 8 seconds. That is 1/100 of a millionth of a second resolution of what that trace was doing on the screen, and they wanted clear pictures to do that.
That was the primary instrument for determining, do we have an electronic system that will detonate these things simultaneously? One of the more interesting things we did as GIs working in a real well-equipped photo lab is the fact that Sergeant Dabney said, I had a rule that we couldn't leave the hill, Los Alamos, so being a photographic organization, we decided we'll make our own pass. And I don't think Dabney knows to this day what happened. We kept that a secret of our own.
So we had to get the blocks just right and chemically just right. And they had to get the detonators just right so that there was no spread in their firing. They all had to fire exactly the same time. And how the detonators themselves were made and the power supply that fired the detonators, how did you do that? There were so many things that had to turn out just right in order to make that thing perform that people were worried about it. In fact, that was the only reason Jumbo was ever built. And they only decided not to use Jumbo about 2 weeks before the shot. We didn't have time to get sophisticated about anything. It was almost always what is on the market, what is available that we can modify or gang up with something else to do our job without getting into a lot of development work on some new, untried component. Use what's available. And that philosophy prevailed through the design of the whole weapon. That's why we called the thing a gadget. It was certainly not a well-engineered affair. We got around to doing that after the war. Something should be said about the fact that the bomb had to be delivered by an airplane, and a different group of engineers were working on that particular problem.
Well, the younger Leon Smith had decided on the spur of the moment in 1938 to go to the University of Wisconsin and take electrical engineering and patent law. And this young man had essentially finished the engineering, was ready to go into law school. When he got drafted rather quickly, he had made the mistake earlier of trying to enlist in the Marines because people were very patriotic at that point in time. But the Marines took one look at that poor, miserable physical misfit and said, nah, go home. Just getting to Wendover was difficult because since the orders were secret, I couldn't show them to anyone. And without the military people seeing orders, you couldn't get a seat on an airplane. So our job really was to assist Los Alamos in designing and developing the fusing and firing system. The basic fuse was the proximity radar. Anyone in the airplane did not want the bomb to go off while it was underneath the airplane. And the radar saw the airplane as a target, just as it would have seen the ground as a target. So there were pressure sensing devices in the bomb to be sure that the radar was not armed until it was close to the desired altitude. I designed the flight test box used to check out the atomic bombs. We particularly wanted to know if the batteries were working. We wanted to know if the radars were working. You wanted it to be safe and reliable and go boom in a very big way. I remember one time the system did not work. And I think we worked straight through for between 48 and 72 hours. It was simply a soldered ground connection that had broken loose. When you're out there with a war, you do what you can do. You don't worry about hours and things of that type. You do what's necessary to get your job done.
It's unbelievable the things that you would see on this crummy little 9-square-mile island. I saw young boys with their arms off, with their legs off, their faces shot off. Of course, there was some you saved and some you really couldn't save because of the condition they were in. We had one guy with both legs and both arms off, and when we sent him to the ship, he was still alive. You look back and you say, how did I do it? One morning I went into a tent and there was about 12 or 13 men laying there, but they were all dead, every one of them. And then you would see somebody that looked like they'd breathe, and one time I said to one of the doctors, I said, that guy's still alive. He says, no, you just don't die all at once. It was just a catastrophe.
I was feeling like it was going to go and go big.
Well, it was open desert, and about all there were around there was coyotes and badgers and things like that. So we were particularly interested in water, and that's when the fun began. One thing that we had to have for instrumentation purposes was a good electrical ground. Water is a good ground. The problem we had not reckoned about was the people that occupied the range illegally. They're a pretty rough, tough bunch of range cattle growers, and they gave us a lot of trouble from the standpoint that they'd ride wherever we had the water wells dug for electrical grounds. They'd come along on horseback at night and drop dynamite down the wells and blow them up.
Hold them up, Simon!
The base camp was just a series of bunkhouses with pipe frame beds and no window, just holes in the wall where the wind would blow through and the crows would come through, and the crows would sit on the foot of the bed and look at you, and they could get out of the sun this way. It kept cooler inside the bunkhouse.
The Germans had already surrendered. Well, they surrendered in what, May of that year, I think, but the Japanese were still killing our guys overseas, and we were just hell-bent to get that thing finished and get it over there, and we knew we had a good chance of ending the war.
It was pretty primitive living, but in those days people were all dedicated towards a given goal, and there was no griping about anything. It was an interesting situation. To try to do this in peacetime would never work, but nobody complained about anything. You just got on with the job and swallowed your pride and went ahead with what had to be done.
No one knew what we were really doing down there. We were asked to do specific jobs, but we didn't know what the job was for. The men got along real well together. Consider 90 people being quarantined to an area in the United States. You spend 24 hours in just maybe a 25 or 30 acre area with a dozen barracks and buildings on it, and you just have to find your own entertainment. We picked up some stray dogs in town. I myself found a couple of crows. Some of the MPs would trap rattlesnakes and all that, and they even built a pen, and they had several of them penned up.
And one night, somehow the snakes got out. I don't know how that happened, but and the next morning there were snakes crawling all over that camp and scared the hell out of a lot of people there.
I don't know why I was picked to go down to the site. I had no skills whatsoever. Being a young 18-year-old boy from Brooklyn, New York, with my Brooklyn accent of Goyle and Boyd and Turdy-Toyd and all that, we got down to Trinity's site, and most of the engineers down there had a specific trade. They were either electricians, carpenters, plumbers, but I worked with every one of them and did the best I could. And finally, they needed someone to maintain the camp. I mainly volunteered because, well, even though it's not a very high-quality job, it's a job that has to be done in any camp, no matter where you are, and trash has to be picked up. And I really felt that I could contribute more to the camp doing that than any of the other skills that they asked me to do.
Things were getting more and more tense as the weeks went by. Construction proceeded on the tower and the hoisting equipment that went with the tower. The thing we had at Trinity was an oddity. It was purely a gadget, an experiment aimed only at collecting information on how the thing worked. All kinds of instruments hung all over it to measure different phenomena as diagnostic information in case there was a misfire of any kind.
Well, one of the big projects there, maybe the biggest, was the effort to gather data that photographically. The brightness would be an important factor in determining the yield, and the size of the fireball was an important factor. It couldn't be measured any other way.
Interestingly enough, this soccer ball out of a sporting goods store probably would have been classified top secret in 1942, 43, 44. Because interestingly enough, its geometry is identical to the geometry of the individual explosive blocks that went into the design of the implosion bomb. So there's 12 pentagons, and in between them are 20 hexagons. All of them have obtuse angles at their corners, which is the ideal configuration to avoid fragility if you're going to make the thing out of high explosives. The spherical assembly had 32 detonation points distributed all over its surface. Each of those detonation points had 2 detonators in it, fed by different electrical systems which came from different directions, so that literally you could go up to the side of this unit and grab any bunch of wires that you could wrap your hand around and cut them, and it would not affect the function of the bomb.
All of our 35 millimeter cameras were operating at 100 pictures a second. We had lots of 16 millimeter cameras that were operating at various speeds, from slow to very high speed. Fireball expansion was important, and 100 pictures per second, but between frames the thing was almost over. So all you get is 3 or 4 frames of the fireball expansion. So at 1,000 or 10,000 pictures a second, you could then determine the rate of growth of the fireball, which was an important item in knowing what the yield was, what the explosive yield was.
Uranium-235 and plutonium are both hot, thermally hot, because of the internal activity that's always going on in those metals. So the core of a bomb in your hand is uncomfortably hot. So the core had been carried in its own carrying case all the way from Los Alamos. Simple physics tells you that things expand when they get hot. So when it came time to put the nuclear core into the rest of the bomb assembly, it wouldn't go in. The hole wasn't big enough to take the core. To everyone's consternation, particularly Oppenheimer, he thought it was a dimensional problem, that somebody had made a mistake in machining, but we knew that wasn't true. It was purely a thermal problem. So the solution to it was to simply cool down the core artificially with ice packs around it, and it went in perfectly well.
The biggest problem was nobody knew how bright this thing was going to be. Our bosses had decided, well, we're going to have at least 3 sets of cameras. We're going to have one set for a dud that won't put out much light. We'll have one set for a medium-sized event, and one set for the very highest yields. We even had a pinhole camera. Our boss, Julian Mack, insisted that we have a pinhole camera. Why he wanted to do this, I'm not sure.
So the main switch then, the firing switch, was now down in the compound at South 10, and it was going to be machine-driven.
While we'd been there for months, you never really get ready. I mean, we knew this thing was going to go the morning of the 16th, and we were busting our butt with last-minute projects.
Bainbridge came to me about 9 o'clock and said we were going to spend the night under the bomb to be sure that nothing went wrong.
The actual detonation time was delayed once because of rain conditions.
However, I was so tired that I laid down about 2 o'clock and slept for a while. But it was rainy that night, and I woke up dreaming that Kistikowski had gotten a garden hose and was sprinkling the bomb.
After we had finished our job, got out the base of the tower, then we proceeded in the Jeep on up to the observation point, which is about 20 miles out across the desert.
We were told we had to be out of our bunks, we had to have the full field on, we had to have our helmets on, we had to be behind the bunker, and we were given these special glasses that we were supposed to keep on, and we could not turn around until we were given a command.
No, I wasn't anxious at all. I knew the system.
At minus 45 seconds, I threw the switch that turned on the automatic timer, and from that time, some 20 signals were sent out to start various cameras and so forth.
The physicists were the ones that were concerned.
At minus 1/10 second, a signal was given to Ernie Titterton, who generated a couple more signals to set off the fast cameras of Berlin Brickner and Julian Mack.
I was looking through the viewfinder of my Mitchell camera, but it had such a dark filter on it, I really couldn't see anything. It was just black. But I was staring towards the point where the explosion would be.
2, 1, 0.
The whole filter lit up so brilliantly, it seemed to be as bright as the sun, just the filter itself, and so I was temporarily blinded. And I then turned my head to the side and looked at the Oscuro Mountains, and they were lit up apparently more brilliantly than in daylight. And so after seeing that for a few seconds, I looked back through the viewfinder, and I could see the great ball of fire was formed and was starting to rise. So I grabbed the controls of my camera and started following the ball of fire.
We were drawing so much current from the generator with 4 cameras going that we were burning the cables. And I said, "Julian, this junction box on fire, turn it off." And he says, "No, let it run, it's still running, let it go." So we lucked out.
Even though we had been briefed rather thoroughly on what we would see, it was still awe-inspiring. You just couldn't imagine the brightness of this thing. Here we were 20 miles away, and it was so bright that all color was destroyed.
And the heat on my body was a thermal blast, so to speak. It was amazing that much heat could be generated by this thing 6 miles away.
Then all of a sudden this column broke through the fireball, and you could see this tremendous cloud of ash and stuff going up into the sky. It seemed like it was never going to stop climbing. It just kept going higher and higher.
Shockwave finally rolled over us with a pretty good bang.
And it just hung there it seemed like it just hung there forever. Then all of a sudden the fireball went out and the light was gone. You couldn't see.
I stepped back a little in awe and said, "My God, it's beautiful." And Julian came back instantly and said, "No, it's terrible."
The fact that it was so big admitted it was awesome. I immediately felt that war would soon be over, because I knew that we had 2 bombs about ready to be used in Japan.
I have to be honest, it didn't mean anything to me. You know, I'm still that 18-year-old naive kid. Never saw much more than a firecracker go off. I had to wait something like 2 weeks after the explosion in Hiroshima to find out exactly what I was involved in.
We had flown to Tinian late in June of '45. We were very busily engaged in setting up laboratories, in setting up test equipment for the various components of the fusing system. We just continued such that we were then ready to test out the components and assemble them into systems for the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. We got the results of that July 16 test rather quickly. All I remember is some tests were successful, and it applied to what we were doing. I had not been informed we were working on an atomic weapon. From everything we knew, we were doing something that was rather important. And we had very high priority on everything we did. Other people were around making things happen sort of instantly. And we were given responsibility, I thought, that was great compared to our young ages. And there wasn't someone there checking on us all the time. We were expected to do our jobs. From our tent, we could see the 4 parallel runways of North Field on Tinian. Some of the takeoffs were rather massive, with planes going down the runways simultaneously and taking off. I've heard the story, which I've never been able to verify, that in January of '45, on the firebombing missions over Japan, 5 of them crashed into the sea on takeoff. I saw one go in one day, scarcely a splash, just a little splash, and then it's gone. There's no way to rescue people out of airplanes that go into the ocean that way. Those people were on their long missions over Japan, were doing very dangerous things indeed. When we were actually approaching the missions over Japan, there were 3 of us that were qualified to go along as the weaponeer for to check out the fusing systems. Morris Jepson, Phil Barnes, and myself. And we ended up, Jep and I, flipping a coin to see who would go to Hiroshima. And the toss came up and Jepson went. You have asked about this green plug, which was part of the safety system. As long as the green plugs were installed in the nose of the bomb, the weapon was safe. Once the red plugs were installed, which were identical to this but red in color, the bomb would have gone off full yield. And this is the plug out of the Hiroshima bomb, which Jepson gave to me on his return from the mission.
It was devastating. It was intimidating. It was sickening. I felt like a terrible tragedy had occurred, but I could also see a bigger tragedy if we had not dropped the bomb. I could see Japanese still destroyed by firebombs like we did in Tokyo, which destroyed almost as many people or more than we did at Hiroshima.
I have no regrets at all After the first test was successful, the war was over within a few weeks, and so I was well satisfied with the effort we had put in during the war.
There was immense, intense joy that came to my mind. The fact that we were successful, that there would be no more island skipping and jumping and invading.
We were sitting there on Tinian. We could look across into the harbor of Saipan. There were 1,600 vessels there preparing for the invasion. On Tinian, there was a 20,000-bed hospital going up. There must have been big hospitals going up on all the other islands, such as Guam, Saipan, and so forth. I had been on Iwo Jima, and that wasn't too many months after the invasion of Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima looked as if it had been rototilled. The battles in Okinawa had been very fierce. From everything I knew, the invasion of Japan was going to be a very bloody event indeed. And from the way the Japanese had fought, they would have essentially fought to the last person in Japan. And probably every man, woman, and child would have been involved in that. And the casualties would have been unreal. I think the use of the bombs by Truman was a very sensible and humane thing to do.
The greatest thing is when that bomb was dropped. We were in training at that time. I fully believe I would have not survived that invasion of Japan because I already had survived 2 of them.
So I'm very proud of the small role which I played in that.
I'm delighted that our efforts came to fruition the way they did. I don't know how anyone can be proud about this sort of a thing, but it had to be. It was there. It has been said by some the world's greatest thinkers that knowledge cannot be denied. There's no way you can walk away from something that exists in science or in nature and say, well, I'll forget about it and it'll stay there. It won't. It'll come out. It'll be dug up by somebody, and you want to make sure it's dug up by the right people.
I guess if I felt guilty about one thing, it's having it so well, while other people were crawling up those beaches under fire. I cannot comprehend it.
And my furlough was right after the war in New York City when the people celebrated for, I believe, for 2 or 3 months after that war. There were what they'd call block parties. I was the only one in my block from the service home. So I got the welcome for all the kids in the neighborhood that were in the service. I got it all. The hugs, the kisses, and the food, and the wine, and the drinks, and even some of the foods that I didn't really like. I was eating it, you know, and it was the first time I'd seen my father get a little bit inebriated, and the reason was he had 5 sons in the service. And we were very fortunate that all 5 of us came home alive. And I felt a little bit of pride in the fact that so many lives were saved because the end of the war came, and I had in my little way, I had something to do with it. And I still feel that way today.
This Colores program is available on home video cassette for $19.95, plus shipping and handling. To order, call 1-800-328-5663.